Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU. On the basis of these damning criticisms, the students declared that they would no longer accept the authority of the IAIN leadership or the Ministry of Religious Affairs. They then promptly left the meeting, shouting more anti-administration slogans as they departed. Although unconfirmed rumors soon spread about the beating of one pro-NU student, the protest had been a generally peaceful affair. It nevertheless attracted the attention of the national news and soon became known as, quote, the October 10th incident. What led the IAIN Yogyakarta students to protest and denounce their own university leadership? When we zoom out from October 10th itself, we begin to see a broader pattern of unanswered grievances. The story I want to start begins on August 17th, 1963, of course, Indonesia's Independence Day, which is not an insignificant detail, when a group of leaders from IAIN, student leaders from IAIN Yogyakarta, released what they called a white paper, or buku putih. Which was about a 20-page long document that detailed a series of complaints against the IAIN leadership as well as the Ministry of Religious Affairs. This white paper, or white book, opened with the following embrace of Soekarno and the principles of guided democracy. It read, quote, recalling that the Indonesian Revolution has a five-pronged, multi-complex, and simultaneous character, that religion is an essential element in nation building, which was a key slogan of the Soekarno administration, and that Islamic education represents a tool to reignite the fire of Islam as envisioned by President Soekarno, the great leader of the revolution. After displaying this kind of pro-Sukarno rhetoric, the white paper then continued by outlining two central complaints that the students had at the time. The first was, quote, the existence of a plan and practice of NU-ization among certain groups in the IAIN leadership. And the second was, quote, autocratic practices in the IAIN leadership in Yogyakarta and beyond. The white paper laid out a series of specific complaints, not both at Indonesia as a whole, but also on the IAIN campus in Yogyakarta, which included preferential hiring treatment to NU-affiliated graduates, that NU students were getting faster and more kind of prestigious appointments into the religious bureaucracy in Indonesia at the time compared to non-NU graduates of IAIN. The promotion of unqualified, as at least the students saw them, NU faculty members over more qualified modernist counterparts across the IAIN campus system, but especially in Yogyakarta. And stories of the rector in particular, NU bureaucrat and well-known former minister, claiming credit for successful academic programming run by more junior modernist faculty. In particular, there was a summer seminar in 1963 focused on building a national curriculum for Islamic education at the SMA level. That went quite well, and these junior faculty members were really excited about it. The results were presented to Soekarno and cabinet ministers at a meeting in Jakarta. And although the rector himself had not been involved, he kind of took credit for this, and this was really upsetting to the young modernist faculty members who had spent months working on this summer seminar. So this white book then listed out this series of complaints against the NU-affiliated administration at the IAIN Yogyakarta, and then requested that the Soekarno government, quote, take firm actions towards retooling the system, so that, quote, the hope of the Muslim community in this national Islamic higher education project should not be broken. The white papers were then sent to Soekarno, top ministers, as well as leaders of multiple local and national Islamic organizations. So after the release of this white paper on August 17th, the Yogyakarta faculty actually joined in some of the expressing their discontent as well with what was going on in the IAIN administration. On October 1st, they released their first, at least the first that I found, faculty petitions that was really requesting reform at the administrative level. So this petition expressed a general sense of respect and appreciation for the rector's efforts to reform and expand the IAIN system. But it also noted strong disagreement with what they saw as unilateral leadership changes, including the IAIN secretary, and it urged the rector to comply with the 1960 ministry decree that delegated that very authority to the faculty. So essentially, the faculty was quite upset that the IAIN rector had essentially chosen the secretary, chosen a chair to the faculty without the consent of the faculty and allowing the faculty to vote on their own representatives. A few days later, October 5th, the IAIN Student Council in Jakarta released its own white paper, another 20-page long document that listed some of the same complaints that the Yogyakarta paper listed, but also added some that were specific to the Jakarta campus. These included administrative discrimination and intimidation of popular Muhammadiyah-affiliated faculty members, and to the point that one or two of them had actually resigned from the IAIN Jakarta to escape said discrimination. And a particularly interesting case of what was named the anonymous letter incident in late 1962. So this incident, as described in the Jakarta white paper, involved an anonymous letter that was sent to Soekarno, as well as top ministers, that actually accused multiple high-ranking modernist professors, including Mahmud Yunus, of being, quote, reactionary anti-revolutionaries who were actually anti-Sukarno. This was a particularly damning charge in late 1962 for modernist professors, since the modernist party Masumi had been banned in 1960, and affiliation with what was perceived as an anti-Sukarno modernist party would often result in, persecution or even perhaps jail time during this time period. This anonymous letter that was sent to Suekarno included forged signatures from both NU and HMI student leadership that were later found out to be false signatures. The police investigated this anonymous letter, identified several NU-affiliated students who had written it, but the IAIN Jakarta administration declined to punish the students and actually protected them from any retribution for trying to get these modernist professors in trouble. So this long list of complaints coming out of the Yogyakarta IAIN and the Jakarta IAIN already out there by the early October period of 1963, when the protest itself gained speed and the Yogyakarta students take over this faculty assembly on October 10th. Shortly thereafter, the physical protest spread to Jakarta, with smaller groups of Jakarta students also storming into faculty meetings, but much smaller in scale than the Yogyakarta counterparts. But this spread of the physical protest to Jakarta really communicated to the NU leadership that this was not a problem isolated to the Yogyakarta campus, but it was something that was being coordinated across the country, or at least between the two major campuses at the time, the Yogyakarta and Jakarta campuses. A couple of days later, these protests hit the front page of NU's national newspaper, Duta Masyarakat. The very first headline, which was actually on the front page, right below the title of the newspaper, read, "A certain group disrupts an open faculty senate meeting at IAIN Jakarta." And the ensuing article describes a scene of chaos and disruption and disrespect happening against the NU leadership. Soon thereafter, the Duta Masyarakat coverage starts to insinuate that this was actually a Masumi coordinated event, that there were outside figures acting as a so-called dalang, controlling the student protest movement. And this really started a systematic attempt by the Duta Masyarakat newspaper to tie the student protest to the banned political party as a way of discrediting what the students were doing. Shortly thereafter, again on October 22nd, Duta Masyarakat reported that at least 2 Yogyakarta students had already been arrested for these protests. So we can start to see the involvement of the local police in these matters. And then on October 28th, the Yogyakarta faculty issue a second petition, a much stronger worded petition, that accused the current rector of, quote, misuse of his power and of prioritizing party interests and U interests over national interests. And this petition then asked Soekarno to, quote, free the rector of his current duties and to take actions to normalize the IAIN system. I understand normalize here as turn it back into an academic institution rather than having it as what the protesters are calling this NU fiefdom. The campuses in Yogyakarta and Jakarta were actually shut down entirely in the wake of the demonstrations and remained closed for more than 2 months, as far as I can tell. Classes only resumed in Jakarta on December 19th and in Yogyakarta on December 30th, when the Minister of Religious Affairs and a new member, Saifuddin Zulri, and the respective rectors convened campus-wide assemblies and delivered firm speeches about discipline, unity, and progress, and the need to maintain stability on these campuses. So following these protests, we can see that there was quite a long time before the campuses returned to normal. I also want to talk briefly about the long-term consequences of these protests for those who were involved. So the first victims were the student leaders of the protests, many of whom were expelled from the IAIN system. For those modernist student activists not discharged outright, the IAIN administration stripped them of their positions on the student council and established an unelected interim board to prepare the groundwork for another round of student elections. By September 1964, no fewer than 14 IAIN students were on trial in Yogyakarta for holding a protest without proper permits and approvals. I could not figure out whether and how much jail time they were given. The Duta Masyarakat news coverage stopped after the announcement of their trials. NU also targeted Yogyakarta and Jakarta faculty members who had supported the October 10th incident. For example, Kafri Ridwan spent 4 months in jail for his leadership of the faculty protesters in Yogyakarta. When he was finally released from prison in February 1964, many of his fellow dissidents, including Zaini Dahlan and Ahmed Khoteb, had been transferred from the more prestigious Yogyakarta and Jakarta campuses to recently established provincial IAINs in Sulawesi or Sumatra. Kafri himself was dispatched to Aceh. The professional exile of faculty members involved in the October 10th incident was part of a wider plan designed by the Ministry of Religious Affairs to restore political stability, or what they saw as political stability, to the IAIN. In January 1964, Zulri issued a strict campus regulations in order to empower IAIN rectors to, quote, protect the progress of the IAIN. While Zulri's memoirs framed the exiles as a way of giving protesting lecturers the opportunity to cool down at less politically charged campuses, the result was clearly to remove these modernist sources of resistance and to solidify NU control over the IAIN system at that time. So with that background, I want to think for a moment about why I had never actually heard of this student uprising, despite the kind of national attention it had received, to the point of kind of receiving the attention of Soekarno in 1963, before I found it in the archives. So despite being very interested in Indonesian Islamic politics in the 1960s, I had never heard of these events before, and actually only can find one brief reference to them in across a series of books, which was in Delia Noor's Partai Islam di Pentas Nasional from 1987. And I think that there are two main reasons why this event has been overlooked in the historiography. The first is, of course, the dominance of communist Islamic antagonism in the 1960s. Of course, this event happening in 1963, only 2 years before 1965. Most historical writings on the 1960s as a result is really focused, and partly rightfully so, on NU's in particular, but Islamic antagonism more generally with the Indonesian Communist Party, or the PKI, and the attempts by NU to counter growing communist influence. And of course, this is an incredibly important and significant story, and there should be a ton of attention paid to NU's anti-communist activities from this time period. But I think it's important to note that that is not the only group that NU is concerned about in the mid-1960s. They remain concerned about the influence of modernist Muslims, both on campuses and beyond. And I think the second reason that this story has often been overlooked or just not known about at all is related to the ban against the Masumi Modernist Party in 1960. So as we probably know, Masumi became one of the most outspoken opponents to Sukarno's government under guided democracy, leading really the kind of movement to call out Sukarno as basically becoming more increasingly dictatorial in the late 1950s, to the extent that many national Masumi leaders, including Muhammad Natsir, actually ended up joining the anti-Sukarno rebellion in Sumatra in the late 1950s. And these activities led to the banning of the Masumi party in 1960 by the Sukarno government. And I suggest that there is an assumption that when Masumi is banned in 1960, that actually really kind of represented the end of traditionalist modernist competition in the 1960s, because that moment was supposedly the victory moment for NU. That after Masumi is banned, there's no more kind of power base for modernists to mobilize around, and it's just a story as a result of NU domination. And to some degree that is true, as I've been noting, and you did have control over the Ministry of Religion and over the administration at the IAN, but there is still a very active modernist base, as we can see from these protests coming out. So this kind of national story of the ban of Masumi has in some ways kind of overshadowed what's happening in the campuses and what's happening at kind of the grassroots level. So with that background, I want to think about how I actually discovered this story to begin with, which was really just kind of a story of luck. I visited the Indonesian National Archives in Jakarta back in 2012, so like 10 years now. Doesn't feel that long ago, but it is now, and was doing some research into the history of Islamic higher education in Indonesia. And as I was kind of searching through the archives and using the indexes, I discovered a series of folders in Ruslan Abu Ghani's files about this uprisings. So I found the white papers there and the faculty petitions and responses to the faculty petitions, etc., all in these personal files of Ruslan Abu Ghani. So in case people don't know, Ruslan Abu Ghani was actually a prominent diplomat under Sukarno and then Suharto. He actually made the transition between the Sukarno and Suharto years. He chaired the 1955 Bandung Conference, and then he served as Indonesia's ambassador to the UN in the late 1960s in the early period of the New Order. He was actually the Minister of Information at the time of these protests in the IAN, so in 1963. And I thought that the fact that these documents were all in his folders, rather than in the Ministry of Religious Affairs folders or in folders related to the IAN, highlighted to me that these were indeed delivered, at least to some of Sukarno's top ministers during the time period, and that this issue had reached the attention of high-ranking governmental figures in Jakarta. So that's the first set of sources. That's really where I discovered this event out of the Indonesian National Archives. And then the second set of sources I was using and relying heavily on was NU's national newspaper, the Duta Masyarakat, which actually had this incident on the front page of the newspaper on again and off for about 2 months. So you can see here the October 16th issue, and right next to the main headline, the one on the right-hand side, is the first coverage of these protests in the IAN Yogyakarta at the time. So this is a pretty big story for NU, and it also receives on again, off again coverage in some modernist papers from the time, especially Hamka's Gema Islam. So even though historians have generally forgotten the existence of this event, we can see that it actually attracted quite a bit of national attention at the time, both from high-ranking Sukarno officials and also from Muslim-oriented national news media. So I want to think for a few minutes now about what we accomplish by studying the October 10th incident and adding it back into the historiography after this period of it being overlooked. And the first point I want to make here is that the October 10th incident helps us understand how the traditionalist-modernist conflict or tension became institutionalized and how it affected the everyday life of Muslims in the 1960s. So historians have long focused on high-level party politics in Jakarta, and also the intellectual contributions of leading traditionalists and modernist intellectuals. So we have historians who have studied political maneuvering, party leadership, but also the kind of history of ideas that the kind of leading intellectuals of both persuasions have produced. But I wanted to ask a slightly different question from this article, which is how exactly did traditionalist modernist tensions affect the everyday lives of lower ranking or kind of grassroots individuals? And to me, this is really a story, and the answer to that question is really about kind of the career trajectories of professors and students at the IAIN and how that became entangled with your affiliation with either Muhammadiyah, other modernist groups, or NU. As we can see, certain professors were getting promoted over other professors due to their NU affiliation or lack thereof during the 1960s. Certain students were getting access to certain career opportunities heading into the Ministry of Religious Affairs in particular, versus other students who had those opportunities closed to them in the 1960s because they were affiliated with modernist parties. Certain students were able to win leadership positions on the IAIN campus and retain control over those leadership positions because they had good working relationships with the NU administration, versus certain modernist students who were either barred from or then pushed out of those leadership positions. So when we start thinking about the modernist is traditionalist tension as not something that is just about Quranic interpretation and kind of how one practices and if one practices ijtihad, but rather is something that is really shaping the kind of possibilities of who can become a successful bureaucrat or a successful civil servant in the 1960s. And as a result, this becomes, to me, a story of modernist traditionalist tensions really becoming about control over the bureaucracy. Who is going to control the growing space of the Ministry of Religious Affairs? Who is going to get access to the most kind of prized positions within the Ministry of Religious Affairs? And who's going to create policy for the next generation within the Ministry of Religious Affairs? So we can think about the kind of modernist traditionalist tension as really kind of like a battle over the control of the growing religious bureaucracy, in addition to this kind of intellectual battle that is happening. The second point I want to make, which to me is more important, is to note that it is both the NU traditionalists and the modernist protesters in the 1960s who are embracing Sukarno's political framework and appealing to his authority. So I think that this is important to note because, as I've already summarized, Masumi, the modernist political party, had been banned in 1960 after a period of being outspoken opponents to the Sukarno government. So the kind of traditional story that historians tell is that the modernists in this period are anti-Sukarno, or at least pushing back against guided democracy and pushing back against Sukarno's government in rather forceful ways, which even leads to the arrest of many of the kind of Masumi national leaders. However, when we kind of float down to the lower ranking modernists, the kind of grassroots level, the picture of their relationship to Sukarno and Sukarno's state changes pretty dramatically. Specifically, the modernist protesters in this case were adopting a decidedly different posture towards Sukarno's state. Rather than contesting his legitimacy, both the students and the faculty members were actually appealing to Sukarno and to his inner circle for support. The white papers, as I mentioned 20 minutes ago, are actually kind of really calling Sukarno the great leader of the revolution, repeating many of his slogans and asking for Sukarno to intervene at the IAIN to help modernist students access the bureaucracy and to serve Sukarno's state. So rather than modernists pushing back and saying that they did not want to affiliate with Sukarno's state, at the IAIN campuses, they are actually asking Sukarno to open up access to the bureaucracy and to let them serve in his state rather than leaving it in the hands of NU. So it kind of can challenge, as a result, this narrative that I think is pretty deeply kind of entrenched in the historiography, that it's really NU that is cooperating with Sukarno's government and modernists are not. I'm arguing that actually a lot of kind of grassroots modernists were hoping to cooperate with Sukarno and were trying to work their way into the state rather than trying to take an oppositional stance to Sukarno's government. And I want to add one more thing to this, which is, even though the modernists were very much clear, both the faculty and the student protesters, that they were not trying to challenge Sukarno's authority and that they were actually doing the opposite, calling on his authority for their assistance, NU is able to use their national position to cast the protests as actually anti-Sukarno in their newspapers. In this way, NU uses the kind of broader anti-Masumi rhetoric, the ban of the party, the kind of delegitimization of Masumi as an anti-Sukarno force, and applies that to the protesters, even though this is an incorrect, if you read the protesters' writings, application. And kind of connection to draw. So the NU newspapers are often saying that the real power holders behind these protests are former Masumi figures, that the students are actually counter-revolutionaries who are out there to challenge Sukarno's revolution and to challenge the kind of unity of the Indonesian nation at this moment, and especially the unity of Indonesian Muslims. Whereas the students themselves had been doing exactly the opposite. So even though the modernists had actually been trying to kind of appeal to Sukarno and kind of use the guided democracy political framework, NU is able to paint them as doing the opposite and really kind of use that, that rhetoric to kind of quash the student protests pretty effectively. And I just want to now tell a quick little kind of afterwards of these protests and to think about their kind of longer term impact going into the 1970s. So although Nahdlatul Ulama emerged triumphant in 1963 out of these protests and was able to retain its control over the State Islamic Institute system, its monopoly over state religious institutions was rather short-lived. In the early years of Suharto's new order, a range of critics emerged to challenge NU's bureaucratic dominance. Foremost among them were some of the very IAIN faculty members who had been persecuted in the aftermath of the October 10th incident, like Kafuri Ridwan, who had spent 4 months in jail. After completing a master's degree from the McGill Institute of Islamic Studies and securing a junior-level faculty position at the IAIN Jakarta in the late 1960s, Kafuri helped to organize an informal discussion group where young modernist professors shared criticisms of the IAIN and the NU-dominated Ministry of Religious Affairs. During one session, Kafuri suggested that the group counter NU's political power by aligning themselves with an even more influential force, Suharto's newly consecrated Golkar. The men agreed. Kafuri thus reached out to top New Order officials, cultivating a relationship with Suharto's political advisor, Ali Mortopo. With Mortopo's support, Kafuri founded the IAIN Jakarta Professional Association, or Korko IAIN, in 1970, and it subsequently joined Golkar. The alliance quickly bore fruit for Kafuri and his colleagues. After Golkar's electoral victory in 1971, Suharto dethroned NU from its long reign over the Ministry of Religious Affairs and appointed a modernist IAIN professor, Mukti Ali, who's pictured on the right, as the new Minister of Religion. Under Mukti Ali, Kafuri Ridwan, and many other October 10th incident alumni rose to influential positions in the IAIN administration or within the ministry itself. For example, Zani Dahlan served as rector of the IAIN Yogyakarta from 1976 to 1983. Islamic bureaucratic politics had thus come full circle. While NU wielded bureaucratic authority through the language of guided democracy, its modernist opponents inherited the institutional reins thanks to the developmentalist ideology of Suharto's New Order. So the very same people who had been protesting and then exiled off of these campuses in Yogyakarta and Jakarta in the 1960s actually come back in the early Suharto years and take over the kind of bureaucratic power on these campuses. I tell the story of this so-called McGill Mafia and the modernist reforms at the Ministry of Religious Affairs in much greater depth in my new book, Who's Islam? The Western University and Modern Islamic Thought in Indonesia. But that's a history for another day, and I will save that for another time. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Prof. Abbas. Interesting insight, because it started from a student protest, but apparently it became another debate for the higher up. We have two people raising hand. First, Reza.
Okay, thank you for your time, and thank you for Professor Abbas, Mr. Thomas Petru, and Susan for joining our discussion tonight. So actually, I have a minor question, maybe some questions that I have for quite a long time, because lately I was researching about HMI, Himpunan Mahasiswa Islam, and the thing that I want to ask is, there are a lot of quotes from about HMI that connects HMI with Masyumi, mostly about those who studied about, G30 SPKI and kind of things, Those people quoted from Harian Rakyat, PKI affiliated newspaper, but this one is interesting because your new research about the problem in the IAIN, you said that since its establishment in 1947, the predominantly modernist HMI had nurtured an unofficial relationship with Masyumi, both at the personal and ideological levels. This is very interesting because I me personally haven't found any relationship between Masyumi or HMI. Yeah, maybe several people like HMI founder Lafran Pane was a Masyumi member back then, but he was not. He was not taking those HMI member into Masyumi. So please give me some enlightenment. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So tied to this, the October 10th incident, the HMI's role is quite interesting to me. So a lot of HMI student members were actually part of these protests, but the organization as a whole refused to come out in support of the protests, predominantly out of fears that they would be cast as pro-Masyumi or kind of tied to Masyumi, and therefore potentially banned as well. Because in this time period in the early 1960s, so between 1960, the banning of the Masyumi party, and then 1965, there's a lot of concern that the HMI might also be cast as too close to Masyumi and therefore also be banned or at least heavily surveilled. So my understanding of this concern is this concern existed because one, HMI was a relatively modernist dominated organization, or pretty much entirely a modernist dominated organization, and that many of its leaders were reading and quoting occasionally from major Masyumi figures, so like Natsir, etc., even though they weren't in direct contact and weren't necessarily taking orders from Masyumi. So I think of them as kind of traveling the same ideological kind of stream with Masyumi, but not absolutely under Masyumi's control. That HMI was an independent organization making its own kind of more local political decisions, but had this continual fear overhanging it that it would be cast as kind of Masumi's student puppet, and therefore had to kind of really carefully navigate that terrain in the early 1960s so that it didn't face any legal repercussions. So that's my understanding of what their position was. I'm more than happy to hear kind of more details. I'm not as familiar with some of the kind of like detailed leadership within HMI in the early 1960s, but that's how I understand their kind of national maneuvering at that time period.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your explanation. But it is very interesting, actually. If you can, if you may, there is one thing that is interesting for HMI in this period is that, yeah, I agree with you that they are in what Sukarno said, vivere pericoloso. They are in danger of being dismissed or banned by the government. And there are a lot of skirmishes between the JKMI and KMNI member with HMI member back then. But there are no research about it in the academic journal lately. So, yeah, thank you for your explanation, Volkswagen.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you for the question, Reza. And now we have the second question from Ariel Tori. You can open your mic, please.
Good evening, Professor Abbas.
Hello.
I have no academic and historical background, but I am a civil servant. But I have big interest in guided democracy era. When I read your article, I found some interest fact that contrast with Ahmad Shafi'i Ma'arif, professor and one of most prominent Muslim scholars in Indonesia. When he wrote his postgraduate thesis, he wrote that Soekarno and his bureaucratic apparatus divide the Muslim community. He stated that Soekarno ordered teori belah bambu, divided the Muslim community. But in your article, you stated that the Muslim traditionalists and the modernists has long-rooted conflict that escalated in Soekarno era. And then when the conflict get exposed in 10 October incident, both of them use Soekarno rhetoric. My question is, what is your opinion about Soekarno's role in the Muslim community and their everyday life? Like one of political science experts said that even our personal life is politic, like that. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. So interesting question again. So I think I would start by thinking about the importance of controlling the Ministry of Religious Affairs to both NU and what was the Masumi Modernist Party before it was banned, to kind of think about their relationship to Sukarno state. So if we think about, yes, Sukarno is moving leftist and is becoming increasingly kind of close to the PKI in the 1960s. So that is, of course, a really important part of the story. At the same time, though, you can think about kind of Sukarno's state as having this growing, sprawling religious bureaucracy underneath it. So this is the time period in the early 1960s when the IAIN system actually is expanding beyond Yogyakarta and Jakarta, and there are multiple provincial IAINs that are being kind of created in 1960 to 1963. So even though Sukarno himself might be moving leftward, there's this growing space and this growing funding under NASACOM with the Agama piece of that for NU or anyone else who would control the religious bureaucracy to be able to use the Ministry of Religious Affairs as a really kind of powerful bureaucratic post to expand their influence. and to expand the educational Islamic higher educational system. So what I am kind of suggesting, I think in this way, is that we can see Sukarno himself, his politics moving leftward during this time period. But you can also see a space within Sukarno's state for Islamic influence, which is, of course, the Ministry of Religious Affairs and then the State Islamic Institute system that is expanding and proliferating during this period, even as Sukarno is moving left. And I see that he is permitting that kind of growth of the ministry, growth of the IAIN system in order to try to kind of hold together his NASACOM coalition. So if the PECI is growing in its influence elsewhere, then NU is growing in its influence and is trying to kind of, Sukarno is trying to maintain them as part of the NASACOM alliance by giving them more financial and kind of political influence over the Ministry of Religious Affairs. So if we think that's how kind of the ministry fits into Sukarno's own politics as the thing that he can give the Muslim community so that at least NU is willing to stay in this alliance that is starting to kind of fracture in 1963, 1964. But then we can think that even though modernists are, again, disagreeing with the kind of really top level politics of what Sukarno is up to, they want control over that ministry as well. And this has been the continual contest between modernists and traditionalists going back to the independence era. This is the reason why NU really broke from Massumi in 1952, which is because Massumi wanted to appoint a modernist to head the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and NU wanted a traditionalist. So even as kind of these top level politics of where Sukarno's ideological leaning is going are heavily shifting leftward, you still have this desire to be able to control the Ministry of Religion and to control, as a result, like education in public schools and the Islamic higher education system. And that is kind of disconnected to some degree from the high level kind of Sukarno politics. And to me, that's where the kind of everyday impact of the Sukarno era comes into people's lives, because you have to, if you're a modernist or an NU member, even if you don't agree with his leftward leaning, you still need to kind of at least pay lip service to the language of guided democracy. You have to call Sukarno the great leader of the revolution if you want to get a bureaucratic job, or if you want to kind of be able to rise the ranks in student leadership on these campuses. So I don't necessarily think that the modernists and even NU necessarily fully believed in or fully was behind Sukarno in every level, but they had to kind of play the game and at least seem very loyal to him in order to access those kind of positions in school leadership, university leadership, and bureaucratic leadership. And to me, that's how it kind of trickles down, is that you have to at least kind of like abide by that framework in order to have any kind of hopes of career mobility in the 1960s.
Okay, thank you for your explanation. Yeah. Can I ask one more question? The last question. Sukarno stated that he is a Muslim modernist, like he wrote in his past article in the 30s, but in the 60s, when he went more left ideological, he gave the religious affair to the traditionalists. It is the pure political pragmatism, or he have some consideration?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My instinct is that that's mostly about political pragmatism, because Massumi, especially under Natsir, is unwilling to go along with guided democracy. Natsir sees it as basically a grab for authoritarian power and really kind of pushes back against guided democracy as a result, and also wants a more Islamic state and is challenging Pancasila, that NU becomes the alternative, the way that you, as Sukarno, can pull in at least one major Islamic party gain their support and build this coalition when Masumi is not cooperating. But I do think it's interesting that ideologically, Sukarno is much closer to Masumi in his way of kind of thinking about Islam and its modernization than he is to NU. But NU is willing to cooperate and willing to kind of really get on board with guided democracy, whereas Masumi just remains absolutely unwilling to do so.
Ariel, sorry, do you have further questions?
Thanks for the explanation.
Okay, thank you. Prof. Abbas, there is a question from Aldi in chat. He asked, in your opinion, should academic institutions like IAIN or UIN, State Islamic University, as we know it now, be under Ministry of Religion or should be under Ministry of Education? Because seeing from your article, the Ministry of Religion is an ideological agency in which academic institutions should be free from ideology. That's his question.
Ooh, yeah, so I'm not sure that I would be comfortable in really kind of proposing a reform one way or another. I tend to think that, you know, every ministry and in the United States as well, every ministry or department has some type of ideological leaning to it or has some type of kind of stance. So to me, it makes some sense to have a separation between the kind of more secular leaning public institutions and then the Islamic leaning public institutions in Indonesia. So I don't think it's necessarily a problem. I think it was much more a problem in the 1960s when it was an absolute control by one Islamic organization over the ministry. And you get this really kind of like grip that NU gets on it because of the ban of Masumi. I think now with like a much more kind of broad acceptability of different Muslim involvement in politics, you don't have this kind of monopolization that is quite as obvious as it was in the 1960s, whereas the modernist political vehicle is entirely banned, and as a result, the ministry is almost entirely NU in the 1960s. So I think the ideological kind of dominance is a bit less now, and I wouldn't, presume to know if it would be better to move control over to the Ministry of Education or not. But I'm curious how other people might think about that.
Yeah, I think my friend also often debate about it too. Next question from Nuruddin in the chat. Can the modernist attitude be paralleled with the Badan Pembela Soekarnoisme, or BPS, which also used Soekarno's slogan to oppose the Partai Komunis Indonesia, PKI, which was close to Soekarno? And in addition to the Duta Masyarakat, if I'm not mistaken, NU has a publication entitled Api Islam in the 60s. Soekarno himself often used the term Api Islam, which was taken from the title of the book Spirit of Islam from Amir Ali. Interestingly, Amir Ali can be said to be a modernist rather than a traditionalist, but because Soekarno used it, the traditionalists NU also used it. Did you also research about this NU publication, which was also published in the 60s along with Gema Islam?
Yeah, really good question. So let me take the first part of this first. Modernist attitude. Yeah, so to me, I think that the modernist use, as I was mentioning earlier, of Sukarno's slogans and the slogan of the revolution is really about a certain kind of political pragmatism of kind of working within the existing rhetorical political landscape in the 1960s. So that if you can use Sukarno's rhetoric and kind of appear to be loyal to Sukarno while pursuing your own political interests. So you can see the kind of local protest movements in Yogyakarta and Jakarta doing exactly that, kind of using Sukarno's own language and kind of demanding from Sukarno that he live up to that language. So they speak a lot about kind of populism in these white papers and in the protest pamphlets that they're distributing. that if the revolution is supposed to be open to all, and that if the Muslim community is supposed to be united behind Indonesia, and if the fire of Islam is supposed to be burning very brightly and leading the nation, then why would Sukarno let NU push out all the modernists from the bureaucracy and out of and kind of marginalize them on these campuses? So I think that like Sukarno's language and slogans become really useful kind of ways of holding the Sukarno government accountable to them. So kind of use their slogans against their policies and say, well, if you really believe this, then why don't modernists have a place in the government? Why don't modernists have a place on these campuses? Why are you not hiring the best and the brightest to carry the torch of Islam? So that's how I understand what they're doing, which is to kind of embrace the prevailing political language and use it for their own benefit, rather than further marginalizing themselves in the way that Masumi and the Masumi leadership had done. I do not think I did look at the Api Islam publication, but I think that this question is so on that it's absolutely a term borrowed from the Spirit of Islam, the book that was published out of India, that Sukarno often quoted from and was really interested in. And it's really the power, if we think of like Sukarno's rhetoric during this period, is that he can do exactly that. He can quote a kind of English language book written in India from a modernist perspective. And because his rhetorical power is so strong, traditionalist parties have to start working within that exact rhetorical framework as well. So even though this book might not be something that most members of NU would have wanted to read, since mostly it was in English, but then also would have agreed with, but they are really kind of compelled to work within his frame. And he continually repeats this phrase, Api Islam, that Islam is the torch that's going to lead the nation forward. And if NU is going to be able to kind of take advantage of that space for itself, it's going to have to kind of use Sukarno's own language for it. So to me, it's really interesting the way that Sukarno was able to kind of set the vocabulary at such a like consistent level for even his opponents, that his opponents had to engage in the same vocabulary he was, or you were just sidelined entirely in the 60s.
I think there is a following question from Nuruddin about when IAIN and the Department of Religious Affairs were controlled by NU. Did this also have implications for the Islamic Studies curriculum taught at IAIN?
Yeah. So it definitely did. So even during this period, it's important to note that there are some pretty prominent and important modernist professors who managed to keep their jobs at the IAIN. So I don't want to kind of overstate the case. Mahmoud Yunus is teaching at the IAIN throughout this period. A couple other important figures are as well. But one of the major changes that go into effect when the modernists take over the Ministry of Religious Affairs and the leadership of the IAIN in the early 1970s is the importing or the kind of addition into the curriculum of not just the kind of traditional Islamic studies fields of fiqh and kind of teaching, etc. But suddenly you get sociology, psychology, and some kind of English language instruction more integrated into the curriculum. So during the NU period, the modernist complaint was often that the IAIN looked more like a pesantren. It really mimicked the same type of curricular structure of you went straight in to your major. So if you were going to do fiqh, you were going to go straight into fiqh. You weren't going to kind of like pause and take larger history classes, a sociology class, English language classes. And it's really the modernists who kind of bring in and challenge that kind of traditional pesantren curriculum and start incorporating some kind of more social scientific perspectives and classes into the IAIN curriculum. That's really what's happening in terms of curricular movement in the early 1970s when Mukti Ali and some of the other modernists take control over the system. Yep.
Okay, I hope that answer for Nuruddin. And yeah, also what caught my attention is also what the student movement itself that you wrote in your paper, where it can be said as a grassroots battle for the traditionalist modernist idea, which then builds up to the as a conflict. We all see it coming, but nobody willing to put it on papers. And your article can be said is that effort to put the extra campus organization, as we called it today, like PMII and HMI or the Muhammadiyah organization, as you mentioned it, as part of the flow of history that led to a bigger event or incident in Indonesian history. And we still have time for those who want to ask questions. Maybe I'm actually quite curious about how actually you perceive the role of the student organization in this event.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting trying to figure out who was actually leading the protests for me. So I have the white papers that are signed by several students by name. And they're also claiming to represent the Dewan Mahasiswa IAIN, so the IAIN Student Council. But it's interesting that at the time, then I also have from the archives petitions from the official with the official stamp, the Dewan Mahasiswa, saying that is not actually, we are not actually authorizing these protests. So to some degree, I think it's difficult to figure out who actually was organizing the protests, because a lot of the modernist organizations and the student council were all kind of like backing away from claiming responsibility for the protests as soon as the Duta Masyarakat newspaper coverage starts coming out and an attempt to tie the protest to Masumi, because I think that both HMI and the Dewan Mahasiswa are really worried about being easily cast as kind of Masumi's puppets. So organizationally, they really back away. And to me, as a result, I'm just not entirely sure if the actual student leaders were affiliated with these groups and post facto were just trying to kind of distance themselves from it, or if this was much more a kind of like a grassroots movement that was coming out of just discontent students who were not getting jobs and who were getting marginalized, and it wasn't actually being kind of orchestrated by a really kind of organized group. Yeah, because to me, it's really complicated about students claiming directly responsibility for the protests, because doing so would have really put them at threat of being arrested. So they're trying to kind of distance themselves organizationally from it at that moment. Yeah.
Thank you. It's interesting to see a student movement, and which then led into a bigger discussion about the problem that they voiced during the protest. Because even until today, we can, in any student protest we saw today, they would not really claim that they all started all, because it's a collective thought, it's a collective idea, it's collective discontentment for the problem we discussed.
It's interesting as well that it seems to me, at least from the faculty petitions that were in the archives, that the faculty were actually following the students. That it's the students who issue their white paper first, and they do a ton of research. Like you can tell that these students were doing interviews, they were gathering data from a whole bunch of branch campuses of IANs of who is leading, they're tracking who's getting promoted and who's not, and that comes out from the student information. And then the faculty petitions are actually then referring to the student petition, the student research. So of course, I'm sure the faculty members knew what was going on, but they're actually much more kind of like the secondary actors that are kind of jumping on the student discontent rather than the ones who seem to be leading the discontent. So it really seems to me to have started with the students. The question is exactly which students, I'm not sure, in terms of, are they officially affiliated or are they kind of like a subgroup out here, but they seem to be really the force that is like pushing this issue forward. Rather than the faculty doing it, even though it's often about the faculty, but students are the ones who are out protesting, doing the research to say that faculty have been mistreated, whereas faculty are then only secondarily jumping onto that.
Yeah, that's right. So actually students eventually have to collaborate with the academics, with their professor to get their voice, their aspiration to the higher ups.
Yeah.
All right. If there are no more questions, perhaps Prof. Abbas, would you like to give a note or a closing remark or a comment about tonight's discussion and about our topic of discussion tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I just thank you all again for having me here. I really enjoyed it. It was great to be able to talk to some people who know 1960s Indonesian politics in great depth. That is not usually the case when I present in the US, so there's a lot more explaining that goes on. It was really enjoyable to get such specific questions, and thank you for having me here. And I wish you the best of luck with the new society.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Abbas. Terima kasih untuk kawan-kawan yang sudah hadir dan terima kasih sudah mau bergabung dengan diskusi pertama kami. Bisa kawan-kawan ikuti terus perkembangan diskusi Hari Benda Society ini melalui DFT juga akan kami share atau melalui akun Instagram Hari Benda Society. And I drop link too for the article for those who haven't read it. Please copy it before the meeting ends. Thank you, Prof. Abbas, and we hope to see you in another occasion. Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Good morning.